The billionaire fired the waitress. Then she recognized the pocket watch he'd worn since childhood. Sometimes the smallest object a person carries is heavier than every success they have ever earned. The lunch crowd had barely settled into the elegant rhythm of another afternoon when Jonathan Hale stepped through the front doors of Hale House, the finest restaurant bearing his family name in downtown Manhattan. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath warm light. Fresh flowers stood perfectly arranged on every table. Every detail reflected precision, discipline, and expectations that never bent for anyone. Jonathan walked through the dining room with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent decades believing excellence could solve almost everything. Employees straightened their uniforms as he passed, not because he demanded attention, but because they had learned to anticipate it. Across the room, Emily Carter adjusted the chair at table 12 by less than an inch before placing a folded napkin beside a coffee cup left untouched by an elderly customer waiting for his wife. She noticed details other people overlooked. The uneven chair, the trembling hands reaching for reading glasses, the winter coat slipping from the back of another guest's chair. She believed people remembered how they were treated long after they forgot what they had ordered. As Jonathan approached the private dining room, his assistant quietly informed him that an important client had complained about a delayed reservation caused by an unexpected seating change. The manager immediately pointed toward Emily. She had moved one reservation so an older veteran using a cane would not have to climb the small staircase to the upper dining level. Jonathan listened without interrupting. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable. "The reservation policy exists for every guest," he said evenly. "If we ignore it once, we eventually ignore it for everyone." Emily lowered her eyes for only a moment before meeting his gaze again. She did not defend herself. She did not mention the veteran's grateful smile or the relief in his wife's tired eyes. She simply nodded. Jonathan took one quiet breath. "Today will be your last shift." The words settled over the room more heavily than anyone expected. Several employees exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Emily untied her black apron with steady hands, folded it neatly instead of dropping it onto the nearest chair, and thanked the manager for the opportunity to work there. Her voice never trembled. She picked up her small canvas bag and turned toward the front entrance. As Jonathan reached inside his tailored navy jacket for his phone, the edge of a silver pocket watch slipped into view, hanging from a worn chain polished smooth by years of careful handling. Emily stopped walking. Her fingers tightened around the folded apron. The dining room disappeared into silence around her. She knew that pocket watch, not because it was expensive, not because it was rare, but because many winters ago, she had seen that same watch hanging around the neck of a frightened little boy sitting alone on a wooden bench inside Grand Central Terminal, while her mother quietly held his hand until his family arrived. Emily looked at Jonathan once more. There was no anger in her eyes, no desire to embarrass him, only a quiet sadness that seemed strangely deeper than losing a job. Jonathan noticed the expression but could not understand it. As the front doors slowly closed behind her, he found himself unsettled by a question that lingered far longer than the dismissal itself. What kind of person leaves with dignity after being treated unfairly? And why had the sight of one old pocket watch filled her eyes with compassion instead of resentment? Emily Carter walked 4 quiet blocks before she finally stopped beneath the bare branches of a maple tree where the afternoon wind carried the scent of roasted coffee from a neighborhood cafe. Only then did she realize she was still holding the carefully folded black apron against her chest. She looked down at it for several long seconds before placing it gently inside her canvas bag instead of throwing it away. Some endings deserved respect, even when they arrived unfairly. She stepped inside the small cafe and ordered the smallest coffee on the menu. The elderly owner smiled as he handed her the warm paper cup without asking whether she wanted cream. She always did. Emily settled beside the front window where people hurried past wearing heavy winter coats, each carrying worries invisible to everyone else. The steam rising from the coffee blurred the glass just enough for her own reflection to disappear. She thought about the veteran she had quietly helped only an hour earlier. She did not regret moving the reservation. Kindness sometimes carried consequences, but she had never learned how to regret compassion. What stayed with her instead was the silver pocket watch hanging from Jonathan Hale's jacket. Memory had arrived so suddenly that it almost stole her breath. Across the city, Jonathan entered his penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline, loosened his tie, and placed the pocket watch carefully onto the walnut desk before the floor-to-ceiling windows. The apartment reflected extraordinary success: polished marble floors, original paintings, and rooms large enough to echo even the smallest sound. Yet the silence inside felt older than the building itself. He opened the watch with practiced fingers. Inside rested a faded photograph of his parents smiling beside a train platform many decades earlier. He looked at the image every evening, though he rarely allowed himself to linger there. Today was different. Instead of seeing only his parents, he kept remembering the strange expression in Emily's eyes. It had not been accusation. It had almost looked like recognition, softened by sorrow he could not explain. He closed the watch slowly and rested his hand over it without moving. Downstairs in the city, Emily arrived at the modest white house she shared with her grandmother, Eleanor. The familiar smell of homemade vegetable soup drifted through the kitchen before the front door even closed. Eleanor noticed the folded apron immediately but asked no questions. She simply poured coffee into 2 worn ceramic mugs and waited. Silence had always been the language their family trusted most. After dinner, Emily opened an old cedar chest tucked beneath the staircase and carefully removed a weathered family photograph wrapped inside soft linen. The edges had yellowed with time, but the faces remained clear. A smiling young woman, Emily's mother, knelt beside a frightened little boy sitting alone on a wooden bench inside Grand Central Terminal. Around the boy's neck hung a silver pocket watch attached to a thin chain. Emily traced the image gently with one fingertip before looking toward her grandmother. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment and whispered, "Your mother never forgot that child." Emily folded the photograph carefully and returned it to the cedar chest exactly as she had found it. She was no longer wondering whether Jonathan remembered that winter afternoon. She found herself wondering what kind of loneliness a man must carry if he could wear the same pocket watch every day for decades, and still forget the kindness that once helped him make it safely home. The following morning, the city woke beneath a sky the color of brushed silver, and a quiet snowfall softened the noise that usually rushed through Manhattan before sunrise. Emily Carter buttoned her dark winter coat and slipped the old family photograph into her canvas bag before leaving home. She did not know why she had brought it with her. Perhaps memories sometimes needed fresh air just as much as people did. At the restaurant, the familiar scent of fresh coffee drifted through the dining room while sunlight slowly found its way across polished wooden tables. Emily no longer wore the black apron that had once defined her place there. Yet habit led her to straighten a slightly crooked chair near the window before she realized she no longer worked there. She smiled quietly at herself and stepped back. Some kindness remained even after circumstances changed. Across town, Jonathan Hale stood inside his silent penthouse holding the silver pocket watch in one hand and a faded photograph of his parents in the other. For the first time in years, he noticed something he had overlooked countless evenings before. Behind his parents, barely visible near the edge of the train platform, stood a young woman kneeling beside a frightened child. Time had faded the image until only shapes remained, but something about her posture stirred a memory too distant to fully reach. He slipped both the watch and the photograph into his coat pocket instead of returning them to the drawer. Before leaving for work, he paused beside the apartment door longer than usual, as though uncertain whether he was walking toward another business day or toward something far older than success. Later that afternoon, Jonathan stopped at the small neighborhood cafe where Emily often bought coffee, though he did not know she visited it regularly. He simply wanted a few quiet minutes before another meeting. The elderly owner recognized him from newspaper photographs but greeted him no differently than anyone else. While waiting for his order, Jonathan noticed a familiar canvas bag resting on the chair beside the window. Emily sat there reading a worn library book while absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the old family photograph tucked partly inside its protective sleeve. Their eyes met almost at the same moment. Neither looked surprised. Emily gently closed the book and stood. Jonathan walked toward her without the confidence he usually carried into boardrooms. His hand rested unconsciously over the pocket watch inside his coat. Emily noticed the gesture immediately. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The cafe seemed to grow quieter around them. Finally, Jonathan said, almost apologetically, "I think we have remembered the same day for very different reasons." Emily looked at the steaming coffee between them before answering. Some memories wait patiently until both people are ready to see them. She did not remove the photograph from her bag. Jonathan did not take out the pocket watch. Neither of them felt the need to prove anything. The truth no longer seemed like something to win, felt like something to protect. As snow continued falling beyond the cafe window, the elderly owner quietly placed 2 fresh coffee cups on the table without asking who would pay. Jonathan looked at the gesture, then at Emily, and understood that kindness often arrived long before anyone found the words to explain it. Walking away from the cafe later that afternoon, he no longer wondered whether Emily truly remembered the frightened little boy from the train station. He found himself wondering why her mother had chosen to comfort a stranger's child so completely, then ask for nothing in return, and whether he had spent the last 40 years searching for success when what he had really been missing was the courage to live with that same quiet generosity. The snow continued falling softly outside the cafe long after most customers had hurried back into the rhythm of the city, but neither Jonathan Hale nor Emily Carter seemed eager to leave. Their coffee cups had grown almost empty, leaving only thin rings of warmth against the wooden table, while the old photograph rested quietly inside Emily's canvas bag and the silver pocket watch remained tucked safely inside Jonathan's coat. Neither object had changed, yet both somehow carried a different weight than they had only an hour earlier. Jonathan looked through the cafe window toward Grand Central Terminal, standing only a few blocks away, its stone facade rising above the streets exactly as it had decades before. "Would you walk there with me?" he asked gently. Emily hesitated only for a moment before nodding. She sensed this was not an invitation to revisit history. It was an invitation to understand it. They crossed the busy streets in thoughtful silence, passing strangers wrapped in heavy winter coats, parents holding children's hands, and older couples moving slowly enough to notice one another. When they entered the station, the familiar sound of footsteps echoed beneath the high ceiling. Travelers hurried toward distant platforms, unaware that 2 people nearby were quietly searching for a memory instead of a train. Jonathan slowed as they approached an old wooden bench preserved near one side of the terminal after a recent restoration. He stopped several feet away. "I think it was here," he whispered. Emily carefully removed the faded photograph from her bag. Time had softened its colors, but the bench, the columns, and even the angle of the afternoon sunlight looked remarkably familiar. She held the photograph beside the real scene until past and present almost touched. Jonathan reached inside his coat and opened the silver pocket watch. For the first time in many years, he looked beyond the photograph of his parents tucked inside its cover. As fragments of memory slowly returned, he remembered cold hands, frightened tears, and a woman kneeling to wrap her own winter coat around his shoulders while telling him that being lost never meant being forgotten. He closed his eyes. "She stayed with me," he said quietly. "Everyone else walked by. She stayed." Emily looked toward the station ceiling before answering. "That was who my mother was." There was no pride in her voice, only gratitude for having been raised by someone who believed strangers deserved the same compassion as family. Jonathan carefully returned the watch to his pocket, then accepted the old photograph from Emily with both hands. He studied the smiling face of her mother for several long seconds before handing it back just as carefully. "Thank you for bringing her back to me," he said. Emily gently shook her head. "You carried her with you all these years. You just did not know it." Nearby, an elderly railroad volunteer noticed an older gentleman struggling to lift a suitcase and quietly stepped forward to help without being asked. Jonathan watched the small act unfold in silence. He realized the station had not truly changed since his childhood. Kindness had always been here. He had simply forgotten how to recognize it. As they slowly walked toward the exit together, neither of them spoke about the job Emily had lost or the years Jonathan had spent chasing success. Those things suddenly seemed much smaller than the quiet truth waiting between them. Emily found herself wondering whether forgiveness sometimes begins long before anyone actually says the words, simply because one person chooses to remember another with compassion instead of judgment. The days that followed did not transform Jonathan Hale overnight, and perhaps that was why the change felt real. Each morning he still arrived before the restaurant opened, carrying the same silver pocket watch in his coat pocket. But his first stop was no longer the office overlooking financial reports. Instead, he walked slowly through the dining room while sunlight stretched across polished wooden tables, quietly straightening a chair, picking up a forgotten menu, or placing fresh flowers where yesterday's bouquet had begun to fade. Employees noticed the difference without speaking about it. Respect grew best when no one tried to advertise it. Emily Carter found temporary work at the neighborhood cafe, where she had often stopped for coffee after long shifts. The owner welcomed her with little more than a smile and an apron that had clearly been worn by many people before her. She accepted it gratefully. Every morning she served commuters rushing toward Grand Central Terminal, remembering names, favorite pastries, and how much cream each regular preferred in their coffee. She never compared the little cafe to the grand restaurant she had left behind. Kindness belonged everywhere. One cold afternoon Jonathan stepped inside the cafe, not because he knew Emily would be there, but because a meeting nearby had ended earlier than expected. The small bell above the door chimed softly. Emily looked up from the espresso machine, surprised but completely composed. She greeted him exactly as she greeted every customer. "Good afternoon. What may I bring you?" Jonathan smiled almost shyly. "Whatever you think someone should drink on a day like this." Emily poured fresh coffee into a sturdy ceramic mug instead of a paper cup. Beside it she placed a warm cinnamon roll that had slightly cracked while baking and could no longer be sold at full price. "My mother always said imperfect things often taste better," she said with a gentle smile. Jonathan thanked her quietly and carried the tray to a window table. As he reached for his wallet, the silver pocket watch slipped briefly into view. Emily noticed it again, but this time the sight no longer filled her with sadness alone. It reminded her that some people carried memories because they refused to let go, while others carried them because they had forgotten how to return. Before leaving, Jonathan noticed an elderly customer searching anxiously beneath his chair. Without hesitation he knelt, found a folded prescription receipt that had drifted beneath the table, and handed it back with both hands. The older man accepted it with visible relief, explaining that he needed it to collect medicine for his wife. Jonathan simply nodded, wished him well, and quietly walked toward the door. Emily watched the exchange from behind the counter. No one recognized the billionaire. No cameras recorded the moment. It was just one stranger helping another. As Jonathan stepped outside into the crisp winter air, he glanced once through the cafe window. Emily was carefully wrapping the remaining cinnamon roll for a young construction worker who admitted he could only afford coffee that afternoon. She slipped the pastry into the bag without adding it to the receipt. Jonathan stood perfectly still for a heartbeat before walking away. He no longer wondered whether Emily had forgiven him for taking away her job. A different question settled quietly into his heart. How had she learned to keep giving away kindness after life had given her so many reasons to hold it back? The weeks that followed settled into a quiet rhythm that neither Jonathan Hale nor Emily Carter could have planned. Winter remained over the city, but something gentler had begun to replace the cold each time they crossed paths. Jonathan no longer visited the neighborhood cafe because he wanted answers about the pocket watch. He came because the room reminded him of the kitchen where his mother had once poured coffee into mismatched mugs, while telling him that no one should ever become too important to notice another person's loneliness. Emily never asked why he returned. She simply welcomed him the way she welcomed every customer, with the same warm smile, the same careful attention, and the same quiet dignity. One snowy Thursday afternoon, the elderly cafe owner struggled to carry several heavy boxes of supplies from the delivery truck. Before anyone could ask for help, Jonathan quietly removed his coat, rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, and began carrying the boxes inside one at a time. Emily watched from behind the counter while preparing fresh coffee for waiting customers. No one recognized the billionaire beneath the simple work. No one took photographs. The owner thanked him with a gentle pat on the shoulder instead of admiration. Jonathan found that the gesture meant more than any business award resting in his office. After the last box had been carried inside, Emily poured 2 fresh cups of coffee and placed them near the front window. They sat together without hurry, watching children laugh while building a small snowman across the street. Jonathan reached into his coat and removed the silver pocket watch. This time he did not hide it. He rested it carefully beside the coffee cup, letting the afternoon sunlight reflect softly across its worn surface. Emily reached into her canvas bag and quietly placed the faded family photograph beside it. The 2 objects rested only inches apart on the table, connected by decades of memory instead of words. Jonathan studied the photograph again. "My father searched for me for hours that day," he said softly. "But the part one remembered most was your mother's voice telling me that frightened children never have to be brave by themselves." Emily looked down at the photograph with a gentle smile. "She told me the same thing when I was little," she replied. "She believed kindness should feel like home." Jonathan lowered his eyes. For years he had believed the pocket watch reminded him to honor his family. Now he realized it had been quietly reminding him to honor the woman who had protected a frightened stranger without expecting recognition. Before leaving the cafe, he noticed a folded receipt lying near the register where a customer had accidentally left it behind. He picked it up, walked outside, and caught the older gentleman before he reached the corner. The man accepted it with grateful relief, explaining that it was needed to return a medical device for his wife. Jonathan simply smiled and wished them both well. Returning to the cafe, he found Emily watching through the window. Neither of them mentioned what had happened. They no longer needed to explain kindness to each other. As Jonathan slipped the pocket watch back into his coat beside the old photograph he had begun carrying again, Emily realized something had quietly changed inside her own heart. She had spent years believing that trust was something people earned only after proving themselves beyond doubt. Yet watching Jonathan choose compassion again and again without seeking praise made her wonder whether forgiveness sometimes begins the moment we stop waiting for perfect people and start believing that sincere hearts really can grow into better ones. By the middle of February, the snow began melting along the sidewalks, leaving narrow streams of water that reflected the pale afternoon sun. Seasons changed quietly, and so did people. Jonathan Hale still carried the silver pocket watch every day, but he no longer touched it as a reminder of what he had lost. It had slowly become a reminder of what he still had the chance to become. At Hale House, employees noticed another small difference. Jonathan now ate lunch in the dining room instead of alone in his private office. He greeted every server by name, thanked the kitchen staff before leaving each evening, and often paused to ask older guests whether the lighting near their tables was comfortable enough for reading the menu. None of those moments appeared in newspapers. They existed only in the memories of the people who quietly witnessed them. Emily Carter continued working at the neighborhood cafe, but she no longer carried the same heaviness in her shoulders when she walked home each evening. One Friday afternoon, Jonathan entered carrying a neatly wrapped parcel no larger than a hardcover book. He waited until the lunchtime rush had passed before approaching the counter. "This belongs to you," he said softly. Emily accepted the package with puzzled eyes. Inside rested a carefully restored copy of the old family photograph that had faded with time. Beside it lay a second frame containing an enlarged section of the original image. For the first time, both of them could clearly see Emily's mother smiling gently while kneeling beside the frightened little boy wearing the silver pocket watch. Jonathan had not altered the picture. He had simply preserved what time had almost erased. Emily traced the edge of the new frame with one fingertip. Her eyes glistened, but she remained silent for several moments. Finally she whispered, "My grandmother will treasure this." Jonathan nodded. I hoped she might. There was no expensive gift card, no check, no attempt to repay an old kindness with money. Some debts could only be honored by remembering them well. That evening Emily carried the restored photograph home wrapped carefully inside her winter coat to protect it from the damp air. Eleanor placed it beside the original on the living room table, comparing the two images beneath the warm glow of a reading lamp. "Your mother would have smiled," she said quietly. Emily looked at the clearer photograph and realized she could now see something she had never noticed before. The little boy was not crying anymore. He was looking up at her mother with complete trust. Across the city, Jonathan returned to his apartment and opened the silver pocket watch once again. He placed the restored copy of the photograph beside the tiny picture of his parents resting inside the watch. Two families now shared the same memory without ever sharing the same name. Before closing the watch, he gently whispered, "Thank you," though he was no longer certain whether he was speaking to his parents, to Emily's mother, or to the frightened child he himself had once been. As the watch clicked softly shut, Jonathan realized that gratitude had quietly replaced regret. At that same moment, Emily stood by her grandmother's window holding the restored photograph close to her heart. She no longer wondered whether Jonathan had truly changed. She wondered something far gentler instead. Perhaps the greatest gift one person can offer another is not forgiveness itself, but the quiet confidence that they are still capable of becoming the person they were always meant to be. By the first week of March, winter had begun releasing its quiet hold on the city. Small patches of green appeared beside sidewalks that only weeks earlier had been buried beneath snow, and the morning light lingered a little longer through the windows of both the neighborhood cafe and Hale House. Change, Emily realized, rarely announced itself. It simply arrived one ordinary day after another until the heart noticed what the eyes had almost missed. Jonathan continued stopping by the cafe every Friday afternoon, always ordering the same coffee served in the same ceramic mug. It had become less about the drink than the conversation that sometimes followed and the peaceful silence that often said even more. On one such afternoon, he placed the silver pocket watch on the table between them, not as a treasured possession to admire, but as something he no longer felt the need to hide. Emily looked at the worn metal with quiet familiarity before reaching into her canvas bag. She unfolded the restored family photograph and laid it gently beside the watch. The two objects rested together in the warm sunlight exactly as they had rested together in memory decades earlier. Neither of them reached for either object immediately. They simply let the moment exist. Jonathan finally spoke. "I spent years believing this watch reminded me where I came from," he said softly. "Now I think it was trying to remind me who helped me get there." Emily smiled with the calm certainty of someone who no longer needed the past to prove anything. "My grandmother always says memories become lighter when they are shared." That evening Jonathan asked whether she would visit Hale House one last time after closing. Emily accepted, not because she wished to return to the place where she had lost her job, but because she sensed some journeys deserved to finish where they had begun. The restaurant stood quiet beneath the soft glow of evening lights. Crystal glasses reflected the last colors of sunset while neatly arranged chairs waited for another day. Jonathan led Emily to the same table where he had dismissed her weeks before. Waiting there were two warm coffee cups, a simple wooden frame, and a handwritten card. Inside the frame rested a copy of the restored photograph. Beneath it, written in careful lettering, were the words, "Kindness is remembered long after power is forgotten." Jonathan looked at the empty wall near the employee entrance. "I would like every person who works here to see this before every shift," he said. "Not because of my story, because of your mother's example." Emily's eyes filled with quiet warmth. She did not thank him immediately. Instead, she carefully straightened the frame by less than an inch so it sat perfectly level. The tiny gesture made Jonathan smile because he remembered seeing her do the very same thing with restaurant chairs on her first day. Some people expressed respect through speeches. Emily expressed it through details. Before leaving, Jonathan noticed a folded receipt resting beneath one of the coffee cups. It was the receipt from the afternoon he had fired her, carefully preserved by the manager after discovering the mistake. Jonathan looked at it, then quietly tore it in half and placed the pieces into a recycling bin. Emily watched without speaking. Neither of them wished to erase the past. They simply refused to let one painful moment become the final sentence of the story. As they walked toward the front door together, Jonathan slipped the silver pocket watch back into his coat, while Emily carried the framed photograph in both hands. One preserved the memory of where kindness had begun. The other would quietly teach everyone who entered that true dignity is never measured by the authority someone holds, but by the compassion they choose to leave behind. Spring arrived quietly, as if the city itself had decided that some endings deserved gentle weather. The trees outside Hale House carried the first hints of green, the sidewalks no longer echoed with winter boots, and sunlight lingered across the restaurant windows long after the dinner guests had finished their meals. The framed photograph Emily had placed near the employee entrance had become part of the building itself. New staff members often paused before beginning their shifts, reading the simple words beneath it without realizing how many lives had quietly shaped that small frame. Jonathan Hale never explained its story. He believed some lessons were stronger when people discovered them for themselves. Months had passed since the afternoon he had dismissed Emily, yet neither of them tried to erase what had happened. Instead, they allowed that painful memory to become the doorway through which something kinder had entered both of their lives. Emily continued working at the neighborhood cafe because she genuinely loved it there. Every morning she welcomed familiar faces with fresh coffee, remembered birthdays without writing them down, and tucked forgotten receipts safely beneath sugar bowls so no one would lose them. Jonathan still visited every Friday, not because he needed coffee, but because he had learned that some places quietly reminded people who they wanted to become. One warm afternoon he entered carrying the silver pocket watch in one hand and a small wooden box in the other. Inside the box rested a handwritten note. "This belongs with your family," he said gently. Emily unfolded the paper with careful hands. It was not a legal document or a gift certificate. It was a letter Jonathan had written to Eleanor, thanking her late daughter for the kindness that had shaped the rest of his life, even when he had forgotten it for many years. Emily folded the letter slowly before placing it beside the restored photograph inside the wooden box. Some words deserved to stay close to home. A week later, Jonathan accepted an invitation to dinner at the little white house where Emily and Eleanor lived. There were no crystal chandeliers, no formal place settings, only homemade soup, warm bread, 2 familiar coffee cups, and a simple apple pie cooling beside the kitchen window. Eleanor smiled as she placed the pie on the table. "Your mother would have liked this," she said softly. Jonathan looked around the modest dining room, at the old photograph resting on the shelf, at Emily quietly pouring coffee, at the winter coat still hanging near the front door even though spring had arrived, and for the first time in many years he felt something he had once believed success would eventually provide. He felt at home. Before leaving that evening, he reached into his pocket and looked once more at the silver watch. He smiled gently before closing it again. He no longer needed it to remind him where he had been. The memory had finally become part of who he was. As Emily walked him to the porch, neither of them spoke about gratitude, forgiveness, or second chances. They did not need to. The quiet between them carried all three. Jonathan drove away beneath a sky turning gold with sunset, while Emily stood for a moment holding the wooden box that now contained 2 family letters and 1 old photograph. She realized that the greatest inheritance any person could receive was never money, reputation, or success. It was the kindness another human being quietly placed into their life and trusted them to carry forward. And somewhere beyond the fading light, the silver pocket watch continued measuring time exactly as it always had. Only now it measured something far more precious than passing hours. It measured a heart that had finally remembered how to live.